Hey, well, thank you everybody for joining us today. I'm Carly Balzaretti, and I am the chair of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee within the School of Nursing and Health Professions. And very excited to have Emebet Aklilu, excuse me, today, who is an alumni of USF 2019 and a Southern California native. She has worked in higher education prior and now has transitioned into the healthcare space. And as a student at USF, she researched the use of restorative justice in care settings. And this spring, she is co-facilitating a race and policing seminar in partnership with the university's Progressive Policing Community Advisory Board. So we're very excited to have her here today to discuss with us some of the work that she's been doing in regards to restorative justice in healthcare settings. And so I will turn it over to Emebet now. And thank you for allowing us to record this session.
Of course. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you, Carly, for the wonderful introduction. So in preparing for this presentation, I was kind of struggling with whether or not I wanted to just lead with the way that I built out my presentation for Health Professions Day, so what I actually did for my capstone work, versus maybe making it a bit more applicable to those who are within the School of Nursing and Health Professions and the work that you're doing in your education. So I've definitely made this more specific to health settings. So I hope that we can all take something away from that, but we can also expand it since we have a smaller group. I really want there to be more dialogue than me just speaking at you all. So please feel free to input in the chat or raise your hand or, unmute yourself and join in, because this is really collaborative. And so I am going to share my screen and let's do this. Okay, and can everybody see my screen? Perfect, thank you so much. So today we're going to be talking about restorative justice and practical uses for care systems. Like Carly said, my name is Emebet Aklilu, and I completed the dual master's program at USF, earning a master's in public health and a master's in behavioral health. So a little bit about today, we're going to talk about what restorative justice is, why it matters, and where do we use it. Some uses within the care setting, implementation, so examples of activities and some ways that practical uses that you can take into your own communities or your own settings. And then if we have time, we can try out an activity, and then there's some time for questions and conversation, and then we can go from there. And from a very important contributor to restorative justice work, Ted Wachtel, says the fundamental premise of restorative practices is that people are happier, more cooperative and productive, and more likely to make positive changes when those in authority do things with them rather than to them or for them. And so that's really a founding basis of restorative justice, and something that I hope that we can all keep at the forefront of our minds as we move through this presentation. Okay, so why does restorative justice matter? What is it, and why do we use it? So, as defined by Howard Zierer, restorative justice is a process to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things as right as possible. From that definition, we can see that there are three primary goals of restorative justice. They are to obtain reparation, have responsibility taken, and achieve reconciliation. And what we can see in the diagram to the right is that it kind of outlines the spheres in which we use restorative practices, and then the ways in which we are not all the way there yet. And so we can identify that in a lot of our systems, we have certain pieces of these things being enacted, but we're not using restorative practices to their fullest capacity. And so there's some room for growth there as well. So to begin and to kind of really set the tone about restorative justice, It was born out of a need within the criminal justice system, and it's a way to address harms done in that system in particular. But what we're seeing now is there are additional uses that can extend to healthcare, to education, and in a variety of different ways. And so before we can fully get into the other sectors that restorative justice may be applicable in, we have to understand how it was built to interact with criminal justice. So in doing some research, I found this statistic and this diagram that shows us how many people are incarcerated in the United States. And if we look at this breakdown, we can see that about half, and maybe a little bit more than half, of those incarcerated are actually incarcerated for nonviolent offenses. And so if that's something that we think about, then maybe there's an additional resource that we could use that could take these quote unquote offenders out of this system and facilitate some kind of dialogue so that we can move them away from harm that they're doing to themselves, harm that they're doing to their communities, and allow them to better interact with the rest of the systems that we have built into society. So I ask a question to you all, just from a brief overview of looking at this chart. Do you think that it's realistic? Do you think that that's something that we could do? And from this, I mean, the little that I've just imparted about restorative justice, do you think that that could have that kind of impact? And please feel free to jump in or reply in the chat. So my answer is yes, and I think that's why we're all here. But I think there's still a lot of work to do, and there's still a lot of work to better understand how we create those systems. And now I'm seeing that people are, thank you, contributing into the chat. And yes, I agree. Thank you, Dory. That yes, a lot of work and education could definitely be needed. Whoever just joined the chat or joined the call, please mute yourself. Thank you very much. Hello to everybody who just joined. Thank you for being here. Okay, so yes, I think this is a big part of the conversation that we're currently having, and it was actually brought up in the conversation yesterday in a webinar put on at the university, that when we're looking at policing and we're looking at ways to potentially reduce policing within our communities, that there needs to be another resource that's implemented and another resource that kind of steps in. And so we are talking a lot about case management and social workers and mental health professionals. And I think this is a great opportunity for us to expand that resource, because if we can use restorative justice in that way within our community settings, we'll see that we'll have improved outcomes throughout the continuum of care. Thank you. Okay, so let's move along. So I just wanted to give us a moment to kind of pause, to kind of think about what we just saw, and to really understand that when we speak about criminal justice and when we speak about restorative justice, a lot of the times these institutions touch our minority communities, and the disparities that we see are more prevalent within our minority communities. And so if we can begin to use this kind of language and start this dialogue amongst them and amongst those who are more inclined to interact with these situations, then I think we'll all be better off for it. Okay. So to tie it back to what I actually did for my capstone, I looked at restorative justice and its uses in uses for care, but specifically with intergenerational trauma. And so I think that this image is really telling of what intergenerational trauma means, or generational trauma signifies. And so I just want to, kind of bring us full circle here and say that we can, sorry, I'm trying to look at the chat as well and I'm getting thrown off, so please forgive me. But as we can see, like these are pieces of us that are going to be affected for generations to come. And if we don't address these things early on, then whether or not we feel like we've healed, we are passing on layers of trauma in that way for our own families. But something that actually someone here, Dory, passed on to me is, as much as trauma can be passed on, also resiliency can be passed on, and that's something else to keep in mind. And so when we have these conversations about restorative justice and its uses, it's to help us build our resiliency muscle, and so that we can better deal with the traumas that we interact with in our communities. So restorative justice is respect for all, even those who are different from us, even those who seem to be our enemies. Respect reminds us of our interconnectedness, but also of our differences. Respect insists we balance concerns for all parties. And if we pursue justice as respect, we will do justice restoratively. And so I thought that this really drives home the thought of how we can institute this in a number of practices, and how we can really impart that we're trying to find collective understanding and trying to repair harm. Okay, so let's get into some care setting uses and how we actually apply these concepts. So there are 3 practices that are used within restorative justice, and these are the 3 formal practices. The first is the victim offender mediation, which brings together the person who has done harm and the person who is the victim of harm, and allows them to have a conversation and discuss what harm was done, why it was done, and what the situation is. It allows the 2 of them to have a dialogue where they can express their feelings, but they can also come to a resolution together, and they both are allowed to be a part of that decision-making process. So that is definitely one way that we move away from punitive practices and move into restorative practices. The second is family group conferencing. So this allows both the offender and the victim, but also allows them to have their own community with them. So somebody who's important to them, somebody who can speak about their characteristics, to speak about who the person truly is, and also act as a bridge between the one who caused harm and the one who was affected by the harm. And the last is a circle, which is actually adapted from some indigenous populations in the way that they deal with harm and wrongdoing within their own societies. But circles really allow the community at large, as well as the offender and the victim of harm, to come and have a dialogue about how we're going to move forward. How do we see that the harm that was done goes beyond just the 2 of us who are interacting, and really kind of melts into our community, and let's think about how our community is being affected and what's that chain reaction. And when we allow the community to come back and be a part of the conversation, it becomes less of you did this and you should be put away, but more of like, this is the harm that was done, let's understand why, and let's get back to how we heal all of us together. And so that's the key part about circles. So when we think about restorative justice, most of the time we hear about the circle, and we hear about, sitting together and coming together. And so I would really like us to focus on that practice. And I also would like you all to think about situations in your home or in your work life where you see circles coming together. And maybe in that moment, we're not thinking about this restorative practice, but it's more common than we think it is. And it's found its way into our lives in a lot of different ways. So maybe now you'll start to think about that every time somebody says, let's have an interdisciplinary meeting. It'll be an opportunity for everybody's voice to be heard. And so the circle really combines the aspects of the victim offender and the family group conferencing to allow everybody to have an opportunity to come and share their piece. and hopefully we all are able to walk away with some real steps towards solving or repairing the harm. So what I've observed now in the healthcare setting is that restorative justice can be used in what I've identified as these three ways. So the ways that providers speak with family and caregivers and having caregiver meetings, the way that we look at patient experience assessments, and then the way that we speak with and train our staff. So in staff retreats and trainings. And I feel like if we can better implement restorative justice practices in these three settings, then we definitely have the potential to improve outcomes, health outcomes, and just the outcomes that for example, that the hospital is measuring. For us to better understand how our staff is taking care of, your loved ones, we need to not just see data, right? We need to understand how they interacted, who they interacted with, and why there is a discrepancy between us believing we're providing top level care and the care that's being received. And a lot of the times we see that the discrepancy is really the experience, right? So from the provider side, you believe you're doing everything that you possibly can to better the experience, but from the receiving end, maybe you're not hearing the things that are culturally important or religiously important, or just something that I believe I want to or don't want to do. So there are things that we can incorporate to make sure that we're really walking into these situations better equipped to deal with the tasks at hand. So some example activities and tools. Really briefly, here are some tools that that kind of come together. So the first you'll see on the left-hand side are example questions, and these are questions that I think we've all interacted with, but they're separated by just general check-in questions when you're trying to get a feel for the situation and kind of get a tap. Restorative questions that kind of dive a little bit deeper and require a little bit more understanding, and they're a little bit more thought-provoking, and then some closure questions that help tie everything back together. Typically, we use check-in questions as an opening. It's a way to kind of break the ice and initiate the dialogue, and then the restorative questions follow, allowing us to go deeper, and then closing for wrapping it all up. On the right-hand side, you'll see a chart that talks about punitive and restorative. And so these are the ways that we recognize the differences between punitive practices and restorative practices. So punitive is about punishing, it's about focusing on what was broken, and restorative is about focusing on what can you bring to the table now that allows us to repair the harm? We recognize that harm was done, but that's not the main focus, and we want to continue to repair. So an example activity that I created during my capstone work was one of the first is storytelling, and it's pretty much what the title says, but we want to create a space where participants can have the opportunity to share a little bit about themselves and to think a little bit about something that they've experienced that they feel maybe has only happened to them, or maybe it's siloed. And so by having the opportunity to share, we can recognize that there's a lot of similarities and recognize those commonalities, and then be able to bridge that gap. So we don't have to go all the way through the instructions, but basically creating a space for people to have the storytelling time. And then we want to end with, those reflection questions that ask, did you learn something new about one of your peers? Did you enjoy sharing your story? And what was difficult about sharing something personal? The next is an activity that is very dear to my heart, and we're currently practicing this within another session here at USF. And so journey lines, I think is a really good visual representation of how we move across the continuum and how we move throughout history. And so if we create, by creating a timeline that then participants can overlay their own personal experiences and their personal histories, we can see how historical events have impacted our development. And then we can outline and see, like, hey, maybe Carly experienced that event as well, but she's interpreting it differently. And then maybe Megan had this happen around this time when this happened to me. And look, Megan and I have a lot more in common than we maybe first believed we did. And it's a visual representation. So that's Journey Lines, and it's actually turned out to be one of my favorite activities to do. But when we wrap it up, we ask, are there commonalities among your personal histories with, your peers or the other participants in the group? Do you recognize how these events have impacted your growth? And can you give us 2 or 3 words that describe how this activity has made you feel? So I'm gonna show a timeline. It might be a little hard to read, but I can give us some a few of the events. And I also tried to make this applicable for those of us who are studying healthcare. But it starts in 1932, and it's about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and it moves to 2019 and ends with coronavirus. And so we have events such as when World War II ended, we have when the Voting Rights Act was enacted, we have when affirmative action came into play, when the internet was created, let's see what else, when the Affordable Care Act was passed. And so I've also expanded this timeline to include a number of individuals, because my history is very different in comparison to this chart, but we want to be inclusive. And so providing an expanded timeline allows us to have this dialogue throughout, like intergenerationally, and that's really important, being able to bring understanding there. And then to provide a little bit more context, so the Tuskegee syphilis experiment was kind of one of the first situations that created distrust among African Americans in healthcare. And so we can see reverberations of that throughout history. Henrietta Lacks went into Johns Hopkins Hospital complaining of vaginal bleeding, and from there led to cancer experimentation, and how her cells were used in this kind of huge scientific tip-off. Then we have the Committee of National Health Insurance that was established, and so the creation of Medicare and what that looked like for people. And then the war on drugs and how that event has significantly impacted communities of color and what that has meant for our society as a whole, and specifically around policing. And then the internet being created and our access to things and our ability to receive information at any point in time in the day. And then Medicare Part D passing, which talks about prescription drugs. And then I think we get coronavirus, which is still impacting us all right now. So since I think we're doing well on time, we can actually give it a try if you would all like to participate, and it's totally up to you, whatever you feel comfortable with. But I'm gonna put the timeline back on, and you have a few minutes to kind of look it over and see if there's anything that connects or stirs up something for you. And I encourage you to put it in the chat, just so we can see amongst us who are here and a part of this call, what our commonalities are, like how we connect. Okay. Let's see if my presentation, okay. So we talked about, and then we would wrap it up with some of the reflection, which is a bit about the dialogue we just did. What do you recognize? What are those commonalities, and how do you feel? How do you feel this has impacted you? And how do you feel moving forward, knowing that you share maybe same sentiments with those who maybe you didn't think that you would? And that's all that I have to share with you all. So I would love to hear if you have any questions about restorative justice, questions about the use in these settings, any more comments about what you've heard, or the way that you see it being used, or how you can take this into your own life. Dory, go for it.
I'm a bit, thank you. It was an excellent presentation and a good guided reflection. We're working hard to not only educate ourselves and our students, but also to um, improve our own practices. What do you see as are any opportunities we have to integrate the restorative justice principles into our teaching, into our classrooms, into our school?
Um, I think I think it's something that I've noticed, or something that maybe my family has imparted onto me, is giving the student really that onus of taking on their education and the way that they choose to learn, and making sure that they are able to have open dialogues with their professors. And so I think it's really the responsibility of the professor to be as open-minded as possible. I'm currently having conversations with a friend of mine who is completing her graduate degree in education and is wanting to be a teacher. And we've talked a lot about like new age and maybe like old age teaching, and how there's a lot of principles of teaching that's more about, this is the information I'm going to present, this is what the student needs to learn, and this is what I'm going to test. And that's not the kind of teaching that she wants to do, especially because she wants to work with minority students. And so the interaction of how do I allow them to ask questions and dive deeper and continue to expand is a really big piece. But it's also about using different sources. So not only articles, but also like what we were just describing. So using podcasts, using videos, using other ways of getting this information, that not only has maybe an academic view, but also has this cultural or societal kind of conversation or dialogue as a part of it, I think is a really important way that we can incorporate restorative practices into our teaching practices. Anybody else? And I hope that answered your question, Dory. Any other questions? Yeah, Carly.
I was just wondering if you, and I know you're working at Stanford now, if you have seen, maybe at Stanford or at other places, if you've seen kind of this restorative practice, popping up a little bit more, actually in the healthcare settings. Just if has it caught on yet? Has it? I'm just very curious, because I can just see so much power behind it as far as regaining trust of the healthcare system, and just wondering if it's caught, if it's got any speed yet.
Yeah, so particularly at Stanford, I feel like it has, but maybe not with this as the name, right? Just creating spaces for more open dialogue has really been a theme, because we have an emerging um, um, inclusion, diversity, and health equity department that's really being built out so that it has more robust resources for staff. Um, and so in the development of that, we're seeing that we're having a lot more conversations with our executive leaders, really driving that conversation to say, this is what we see from the top, but now let's encourage our caregivers, our clinical staff, that maybe even the ancillary support services. Let's bring all of these people into this dialogue of how can we as leaders better assist you in the care that you give, by creating better systems for you all. So that kind of virtual roundtable has been happening, and I think um, has been creating some change. But I feel like it's also exposing where our gaps are, and where there really are some spaces where there needs to be a lot of growth. And we're seeing, why is there a disconnect so much between our frontline workers and maybe the training they're receiving versus more of our leadership and our non-clinical side? And why is it that we're expecting all of our clinicians to have this robust knowledge and be able to communicate in this way, but they're not getting the same training and the same tools, but they're the ones dealing with the most culturally diverse group of people, right? So how do we better integrate that is a conversation that we're currently having. Yeah. Kelly?
Thanks. This is awesome, Emma Bed, and I want to say 3 quick things. First of all, I really appreciate you being present and sharing your knowledge and your own growth in this area with everyone, since you did this for your field work, right? And it's really cool that you actually have been able to bring this into your employment at Stanford. Like, I think that's just phenomenal. So I just kind of, my hat's off to you for that. Really pushing that and making it work and figuring it out and getting people to engage and talk. Second of all, I just want to also say that I see a number of our current students who are also on the webinar, and I think that's also super cool. I think this is really a really great kind of cross-campus, cross-stakeholders, cross-constituent webinar. So I think that's also really cool. And then my third thing is actually a question. And so my question is, as I'm listening to you talk about restorative justice, and I do remember this from your field work, but you've really kind of nicely laid out the 3 different ways, those core, how you can use restorative justice practices from kind of the 2 people to the larger family, all the way to the community level. I love that. And then as you've been talking, I've also been thinking, wow, I could actually see where this concept or this type of conversation can be used for anything, right? And it doesn't just have to focus on, addressing health inequities, if you will, right? Or addressing racism. Like, I feel like this could be a way that, I'm thinking even within our own school, of how we could have these perhaps more productive conversations with each other, right? With some of the challenges that we're having with different stakeholders and key groups on our own campus, actually. So I'd kind of be curious for your perspective on that, kind of bringing this approach into other non-healthcare areas and settings.
Yeah, I think it's really great that you mentioned that, because it really takes me back to my time in education. And so I remember, working, cross campus and collaboratively. And when emails are just being, shot off, and you're talking about, these high pressure situations, it's really easy to lose that sense of understanding and that sense of empathy with your colleague. But it's almost equally as interesting that once you come into a room and you're around the same table, how sometimes that pressure is kind of immediately diffused, because now you're actually seeing the person, you're actually being able to communicate. And I know right now, because of Corona, we're not able to be in the same spaces, but I think that same concept can be applied. I think a lot of the times we, and this is going to sound kind of contradictory, but we remove the person from the situation because we think we're simply dealing with the problem. But what's really necessary is adding who that person is and like their essence back into that equation, because that's the only way that we can then check ourselves and the way that we're showing up, and recognize that the process that we're going through is also the process that needs to happen on the other end. And so I think in these situations, what could be helpful is having a third party present to kind of play referee, to just remind everybody that, hey, we need to recenter on what is the mission or what is the purpose of this conversation? Like, what are we actually trying to achieve? Because once we're able to kind of go back out to that macro view and see that it's not about like our dynamic, it's about how our dynamic impacts the whole, then we're able to be like, okay, that wasn't a personal jab when Kelly was asking that question in that email, right? Like, she was really trying to find out how we figure out this. And so then you can remove that a little bit so that you can approach it differently. So I recognize that in my own time, and even now, but specifically in education, like I was pulling my hair out, like, why don't the people in that department understand that everything that I'm doing in my department is for the better of everyone else? And they just don't see it. They don't see my efforts. But then once we get into the conversation, I'm like, well, I see how our departments are working simultaneously trying to achieve the same goal. And if I'm not giving you the information you need and you're not sharing with me, that's why there's a lapse. And that's why we're negatively impacting our stakeholders, and that's not okay. Yeah.
Awesome. Thanks, Emma-Beth.
Of course. Any other questions? And Carly, are we still good on time?
We have about 3 minutes, so maybe time for one more question if anybody has any more.
Yeah. It's totally okay if you don't. That's fine too. Okay. So I think the last few things that I leave you guys with are just a few quotes. So the biggest thing is when we develop tools to improve outcomes among our most vulnerable, we will see that we can improve outcomes for all. And I think that's something that we're really talking about here. And then to go back to, I believe, Martha, I actually quote Dr. King because injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And I think that's a beautiful way to kind of tie this all up. So I just want to say thank you. And to anybody in participating today, if you would like to keep in contact, here's my email. You're more than welcome to email me. And I definitely will also be around USF. And I'm really happy and a really proud alum. And so thank you, Carly, for asking me to be here. And I'm looking forward to more conversations like this with you all.
Thank you so much, Emma-Beth. This was wonderful. And Dory, thank you too for connecting me with Emma-Beth in the first place. And the work that you're doing is amazing. And we're excited that you're spreading it out to the community too.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.